just say a few words in kicking this presentation off. We'll first hear from Preservica as our sponsor for this event, and then we'll get into Priya's presentation. As those of you who are members of ARMA know, that we can't do it without our members and without our sponsors. And so coming out of our very successful full day event back in September, we spoke to Preservica, and Paul Stark is here to tell us a little bit about Preservica and what you all do. I am going to stop sharing and let Paul speak for a few minutes.
Beautiful, thank you. Chris, we're thrilled to be back engaged in a meaningful way with ARMA New England. I know we got started with you way back when. Sorry about this. Oh man, I love PowerPoint. Okay, can you see me?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so Preservica is the leading digital preservation provider. Our technology applies specifically to SharePoint, and today's brief presentation and introduction before Priya takes the stage is going to talk about how we can help records managers and records administrators sort of close the final piece of the circle in information governance. So I apologize in advance if you hear snoring behind me. This is my office manager, and she just had lunch. So today's focus, we ensure the integrity and readability of long-term digital records through a technology that we have released about a year ago called Preserve 365. And what it enables record managers to do is transfer long-term and permanent records that are resident in SharePoint to a long-term preservation system that is optimized for preservation. So this is not another add to your system. This actually will save you money, and in fact, probably pay for itself and make your life a lot easier and make your records more compliant. So it's really a win-win. I hate to use that, but it kind of is. It also enables self-service. So your folks who are in Microsoft 365, SharePoint, and other applications will be able to self-serve records that have been archived in Preservica and retrieve them themselves if they do have access rights. All of this is done without ever leaving SharePoint or Microsoft 365. So a little bit about Preservica. We have about 4,000 customers worldwide, including some of the largest financial services institutions in the world, some of the largest culture and heritage and educational institutions in the world, like New York Public Library, Yale University. Over half of the states in the United States are Preservica clients. The largest counties, the largest cities, all manage their records inside of Preservica, those that are being preserved for long-term, I'm talking about 7 years plus. So we collaborated with Microsoft to address the hidden risk of leaving long-term and permanent retention records within what is really an operational enterprise content management system, which is SharePoint. So we are an embedded technology within SharePoint, and the user doesn't even know we're there. However, we address the risk of the 30% of your records and data that need to be retained long-term and permanently. And we, in fact, inherit the retention rules from SharePoint in the process of transferring those records to Preservica. More than half of the CIOs in the country are concerned with data loss. Data loss means a whole bunch of things. I'm sure Priya is going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But data loss in our world means records that can be corrupted, records that should not be accessed, records that need to be accessed 20, 30, 50 years from now that may be in a file format that is no longer supported, Preservica addresses all of those concerns. So long-term data loss is no longer a problem when you implement Preservica's Preserve 365. So records compliance applies to a lot of different areas, and ARMA's membership is really comprised of records officers, both on the corporate side and the government side. I talked a little bit about some of our large government customers, Los Angeles County, New York City, Washington, D.C. Corporately, we do business with some of the largest insurance and financial services companies, also some of the largest brands in the world. So a lot of consumer companies will use older ideas to bring back marketing attraction, if you will. If you remember Coca-Cola bringing back the polar bear ads from 30, 40 years ago, that raised their sales numbers significantly. This enables government records managers and corporate records managers to migrate off of legacy systems while preserving and, in fact, rehydrating those old records for future access and self-service, should you choose to make that available. So what we do in a nutshell is we take records formats and we preserve them and create derived copies that can be accessed immediately. A good example of that is a contract in WordPerfect. We would save the WordPerfect format forever, and we would create a Microsoft Word version of that contract so everybody has access to it. We also create an audit trail to ensure the integrity and authenticity, and make sure that when you need to produce that contract in 50 years, you can in fact prove that it is original artifact. So we have really established the standard for secure process to automatically migrate content out of your Microsoft environment and into an environment designed specifically for long-term and permanent retention. And we do that without impacting the end user, being totally transparent to the end user and under the covers, but manageable in a modern UI for records managers to be able to implement their policies for retention across all of their records. We have a customer right now who's migrating off a very expensive old system into Preservica. They anticipate saving almost $700,000 a year in licensing costs, in maintenance and support costs, and their IT staff costs to support that out-of-date system. So there's real tangible benefits here that you can demonstrate to your CIOs, records managers, and upper management in order to implement something like Preservica. Thank you very much. That QR code will take you to our site where you can register your interest. You can have access to white papers and other research that's available. And thank you very much for your time. And I will turn it back over to you, Chris.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. And I want to thank our Director of Programming, Colin Cahill, for bringing Priya to our attention for this presentation today. Priya Kashav is founder and CEO of Meru Data, who's focused on building solutions to simplify privacy programs for customers worldwide. Priya has more than 20 years of consulting experience in privacy, cybercrime response, e-discovery, and forensics investigations. And Priya, now I will turn it on to you. Yep, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. So can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Great. So today we're going to talk about how information governance and privacy can complement one another. As we kind of look at the agenda, I'm talking about privacy, security, and IG because I know that IG, depending on the organization, there are three places where IG might be reporting to. So one is IG could be reporting. There was a trend at least 5 years ago to where a number of IG professionals was reporting into security because the CIOs, figured out that the best way to kind of ensure security was to at least understand the data. And they wanted the IG team to work under security to help them sort of understand and govern data better. There's also there are also a number of places where IG probably reports to legal, and that might be true. I mean, at least I would say 80% of the privacy teams typically report to legal because it's considered to be a legal function. But there's also a small subset where privacy could be part of security. So and in certain situations, very rare circumstances, private IG could be with admin. But since security and legal kind of are intertwined in terms of where privacy and IG sort of sits, I wanted to kind of include security in the conversations as well. But as we sort of look at the agenda, we'll talk a little bit about how privacy is cross-functional, and then jump into how privacy can work with IG and on what parts of privacy can be supported by the IG teams and security teams as well. We'll talk about privacy by design. It's a big wish list for pretty much every privacy professional, and it's something that is hard to achieve. And we'll talk a little bit about how IG can help support privacy by design. And then we'll also talk about using common frameworks like NIST or ISO, and working together using the common frameworks. So with that, I'll get started. As you all know, and I kind of I use data and information governance, though I'm primarily talking about information governance. Data governance can be a separate function as well, and that's one of the biggest challenges when it comes to compliance, information governance, and security, which is that there are a lot of overlaps, and there are some things that are significantly unique to each of these functions, and depending on the organization, they sit in various places. And privacy and most of my presentation today will have a focus around privacy. So as a privacy professional, it is so important for a privacy to be cross-functional, to break through the silos of the traditional organizational structure, because there's no way to get to a robust compliance posture within privacy. And pretty much all of compliance works with limited resources and a bigger mandate. And as a number of states, especially in the US, where the privacy regulations sort of go up, and also as we sort of start to look at AI governance kind of being brought into the fold of privacy, it's so important for us to be working with information governance, with security, IT, and in some organizations, compliance can be a separate function in itself, and compliance itself to build a robust privacy practice. But what we often see is something like this. And again, we talked a little bit about who they report to, but almost every function is its own island. The island can be big or small depending on the organization, but and you don't see like a bridge built between these towers or islands. Instead, you see like literally a boat, a small set of people reaching out and trying to connect the various islands together, which in itself has probably been challenging, to where if you are a business stakeholder looking at you probably get requests from multiple places. You see a number of competing requests, and sometimes repetitive requests as well. And so if there are ways for us to bridge that gap and build that bridge to where there is a little more consensus and harmony between the various functions, that would that would be the goal, at least, to talk about how it'll both help as well as how to get there. Privacy, when you look at most of these teams, they share similar, but not completely aligned goals. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And part of building the bridge is also acknowledging that piece, which is, what is similar and what is different. So if you see where privacy kind of has to deal with third-party risk management, it's something that security kind of deals with as well. Privacy has a role to play in incident response. Retention and data minimization is a big component of privacy by design that needs to be incorporated, and privacy would like to, it's a place, again, where privacy and IG can work together. Training everybody, as well as building what I would call privacy champions within the organization is a goal that is somewhat similar. Data mapping is another effort where there can be collaboration. Classification of data is another area where we'll talk about each one of these areas and how we can collaborate better. But it's important to acknowledge that as we kind of take a deeper dive into some of these areas, while maybe the overarching goal might be similar, there are a lot of minor differences, in how each of these functions approach the same task. And that might be one of the reasons why it is hard to collaborate easily between the teams. And some of it could also be because of the way we're structured. If you report to the same, let's say if both privacy and IG reports to legal, that kind of creates an aligned, and a shared goal. But sometimes, as we look into an environment where compliance is competing for resources, competing for budget, sometimes that also creates friction between some of these functions. And as I kind of continue to talk more, feel free to ask questions, or if you have comments, if you agree or disagree with some of my comments, feel free to chime in as well. And I would like this conversation to be more interactive. I'm not kind of watching the Teams channel for chat and the Q&A, but I will pause in between to just make sure that we catch up with some of the questions and comments, and I'm So privacy and IG. So as we look at information governance, some of the areas where privacy sort of overlaps or where there's a greater chances of collaboration would be in retention. Because obviously retention is a big part of what information governance. We just talked about Prosevica and long-term retention of data, beyond operational use cases and how to make sure that data is not destroyed. Whereas when we come to privacy, there's a slightly different objective towards retention, but retention is a major focus area. The other big area of focus is, in order to kind of achieve retention, sometimes there is a need for clear classification of data. And usually information governance team is working with the security team to build the classification categories. And there is a requirement from privacy to kind of look at classification of personal information. And so that's another shared goal where IG and privacy can work together. IG typically works where you have a center of excellence, which is very similar to the structure that privacy kind of usually adopts as well. There's a center of excellence, and you're looking to build champions within the various business units, as well as there is a steering committee to kind of bring multiple stakeholders together for decision making, for communication, etc., which is kind of very similar to the way IG programs are usually rolled out. So at a minimum, the steering committees could be cross-populated, but it could also be possible that the same steering committee is shared for multiple purposes. Again, what is the right solution kind of maybe is different, but it's an area where there can be some learnings that are shared, or maybe some places where there's where IG as well as privacy can work together. IG is looking to govern data, and it's impossible to govern what you don't know. And so data mapping is a critical, nice to have effort for information governance. For privacy, and especially with some of the newer states that have enacted privacy laws, data mapping is a regulatory requirement. And so they have to maintain ROPA, records of processing activities, for GDPR. They have to maintain a data inventory for certain states. And so there is a lot of requirements around maintaining a current version of the data map that the privacy has interest in. And so it's an area where not just IG, security also can benefit. So many parts of the organization can benefit from having a good data map. And so it's an area where they can collaborate with each other. The last part, which is data subject requests, to either asking, customers or employees submitting requests for a copy of their data, for deletion requests, or asking for their data to be opted out of certain processing activities or sharing, sale of information. In order to fulfill it, it requires a deep understanding of the data map. It requires retention and deletion to be functioning, and a technology in place, as well as, for some of the things like where you need long-term preservation of records. You want to make sure that you're not accidentally deleting a data that needs to be kept by the organization. So it requires coordination, it requires knowledge, and so a place again where privacy can work very closely with information governance as they're executing DSAR requests, and a process for managing DSAR requests. So
All right,
if we
Priya,
take, yes, go ahead.
before we move along, we've got some comments in the chat. One asking if you can put the slides in presentation mode so we can see them a little bit bigger. And then there was a comment around asking if these were possible strategies for senior leadership endorsement.
Yes, we'll talk a little bit about senior leadership endorsement. Yes, and I think so I talked a little bit about lack of resources, lack of budgets, right? And so sometimes competing goals, and I can give you an example of privacy needs data minimization principles to be in place, right? So which means certain pieces of data needs to get deleted if it's no longer needed, which is a must have, but it's also a difficult to execute, and requires a lot of budget and technology and resources, because you want to make sure that you've done your due diligence before you start routinely deleting data. IT sometimes has requirements for performance reasons to be able to delete data. But again, data is cheap, and business is never willing to give data away just for performance reasons. And you have retention. Almost every IG professional is looking for ways to make sure that the retention is actually implemented to where somebody is actually pressing the deletion button. So bringing these multiple objectives together can create an environment where you have not just one team, but multiple teams supporting. While the priority might not be high for any one team, together it might bump up the priority to get the funding required. So yes, it makes a big difference when you show a coordinated effort across the organization to where certain line items that might be below the line can be bumped up to above the line, or to important enough level to where it can get the attention of the senior management or get the resources and or budget to be executed. So absolutely, these are strategies to think about as you kind of look at alignment. So and as we kind of look at security and privacy, um, security obviously is working on breach response and incident management. It's a very critical function for security. But and it's privacy also needs to do incident management. But it's something that, again, needs awareness that sometimes privacy incidents can occur without it being a security incident. So security incident management does not cover privacy in itself. I mean, some of the security incidents could have impact on PI and hence can have a privacy impact, but there can be many privacy incidents that are not security incidents at all. Like, for example, wrongful use of data or prolonged use of data, or use of data after consent, but they may be for legitimate business purposes, so not a security incident, but they violate the privacy regulations because it is use of data after the consent has been revoked by a customer, which is technically shouldn't be done. So one of the things where they can work together, but it's also important to understand that there are subtle differences and the objectives are very different, and it's a completely different function. But acknowledging that the objective is different, and the priorities may be different, and even the approach may be different, is a first step to a better collaboration. So similarly, access controls, we talk about that being a primary function of security, because security is trying to make sure that you have only access to the right kind of things. You're revoked access the minute you leave the company, or your job role changes. And privacy is very interested in access, because not just for the purposes of making sure people have access, but access for purposes, right? So one of the requirements in privacy is that for example, let's take deletion. If a customer requests deletion of data, there may be reasons to keep data for certain reasons, like long-term retention, for example, or a legal hold. Those are exceptions that are permitted exceptions within privacy. So which essentially means that an organization can choose to not delete data for the purposes of legal hold. But if an organization chooses to do so, then that data cannot be used for any other purpose except the exception. So which means if it's on legal hold, it can be kept, but it has to be restricted from being used by anyone, because it's supposed to be deleted except for that particular purpose for which it was kept, right? So in order to do that, you need to restrict access to that data. And so there is a shared purpose, but the objective and the granularity at which privacy needs access controls is dramatically different from what the security teams typically work with in terms of requirements. And so again, it's an area to work together, but it's also important that there is a clear understanding that the access controls as perceived by security is not what privacy has in mind. And so when you work together, knowing the differences makes a big difference in being able to effectively collaborate together. Third-party risk management, again, an area where security is looking for security controls that are in place. Privacy is looking for usage of data and data ownership, right? So whether vendors have claim ownership to the data, vendors use data for purposes beyond what is permitted within the contract. Do vendors share data with other people? And if so, why, and how can that be managed? So there is a common interest in working together, but again, what they're looking for, what they are trying to manage, control, understand is very different things. But there is a lot of scope for collaboration, so it can be an efficient process overall for both privacy and security. Security trainings are something that we're all used to. This can also be an area where IG, because you have typically, especially if you're a regulated entity, you probably have IG training where you understand what is a record and not or not a record, and how to kind of preserve records and things like that. That happens to new hires. There might be also periodic training, but security also rolls out acceptable use training. They roll out phishing training. Privacy has a requirement now to kind of talk about training. And so when you have yearly requirements for training that are similar but different, there is a lot of scope for collaboration. But it's important to understand that privacy training is very different from security training. And so being able to communicate to the user effectively about privacy without it being confused with security or record keeping, because record keeping is going to say do not delete what you're not supposed to delete. Privacy is going to say if you don't need it anymore, go ahead and delete it. And so it needs to be very clear to the user, because one person is saying please delete it, don't keep it for any a minute longer than necessary, whereas the other person is saying, hey, it's absolutely necessary you check before you delete, because you need to keep the data and not accidentally delete them. I'm using that specifically as a contrast to kind of say, if I'm a person who's receiving both trainings, I need to be able to understand, the nuances between both statements, which are both true, but where which one applies, so that I'm able to execute on the instructions that are given to me. So again, there is effectiveness in training when it's delivered together, because like I said, there's a subtle messages. And so when they're delivered together, it might be easier for a person to understand the nuances better. But at the same time, there needs to be enough time spent on both messages so that there is clarity in messaging. And so again, when you're looking at how to collaborate, you need to understand the differences in objectives between these functions. When I started working with, and I'm going to pause and kind of give a little bit of history about myself. And I think when I started working with, and I want to go back a little bit into my background and experience, right? I have about 25 years of experience, and I come from, and I've had enough deep experience in all three areas that we're just talking about: IT, security, and privacy. So I've worked on a number of security related reactive incidents, and usually after as well as e-discovery reactive incidents, and usually after a reactive incidents. Most companies would establish an information governance program, because they realize the problems of not managing information and the cost of doing so, and want to make sure that they don't repeat that problem again. And so I have helped many organizations help develop an information governance program in-house. And privacy, since all I've done is exclusively privacy since 2017. And privacy sort of, when I started working on privacy, I felt that in order to kind of achieve privacy, it needs to be IG, because you can't achieve privacy without proper information governance. I'm not necessarily saying that is not a true statement, but over the years, having traversed through all three functions, one of the things I've realized is the nuances of each of these functions, and how sometimes not understanding, many times security professionals may not understand some of the details behind, what you're trying to talk about. The biggest example I always provide is PII. PII is a very security term in terms of, because PII is a term that is used in breach notification laws. And so you're looking at, hey, if it is not Social Security, if it doesn't identify numbers or something sensitive like that, if it doesn't identify an individual, it's not relevant to them. But privacy has a very nuanced approach to what is personal information. And so, but while it looks like a small difference, it is impossible to kind of achieve the privacy objectives if you don't understand those small differences. And so over the years, as I've worked on all of these functions, I've realized just that the nuances make it so essential for us to have 3 different functions that it's not possible, or I wouldn't say it's not possible, but it is much harder to merge them all into one massive effort, because there's a lot of detail that goes into what is privacy, what is IG, and what is security. And it might be lost when you're trying to kind of just look at the surface. And so I've developed that understanding after working many years on some of these little details. And I think it'll become much more clear as we sort of talk about, I've taken 2 examples to talk about how, the way RIM looks at things or IG looks at things versus privacy looks at things can be dramatically different depending on the lens through which you look at the same problem. So data mapping, for example, when it comes to IG and RIM, one of the major focus areas is unstructured data. Because you see a lot of statistics about how 70% of the data is unstructured. Unstructured is where the biggest risks are, whereas the structured data is much more managed, and so the focus kind of goes towards unstructured data. When you come as a privacy professional, you don't care about whether it's unstructured, structured, semi-structured, whatever you want to call it. You can call it. It might be, but all I care about is it personal information? If it's personal information, I need to know what is happening to it, where it's stored, where it's going, how it's flowing. I don't really pay attention to the details of what type of data it is. And then when I look at unstructured data, IG or RIM, I'm mostly focused around risks, right? So I can't boil the ocean. So I take a very risk-based approach to managing data. And so the way I would evaluate risk is large amounts of data and key systems. And so my focus, and similar to that of IT, would be the larger systems, tier 1 and tier 2 systems that are usually managed in-house by the company, right? Sometimes you have a service provider, but that's kind of where most of my energy would go. Whereas if you're looking at PI, I think one of the biggest regulatory focus areas for privacy has been ad tech. And ad tech data is not, it's semi-structured and would not follow within the purview of what security considers it as PII, because it's usually device data, it is cookie data, it is click data, and none of that would be tier 1 or tier 2 systems. So nobody even understands what happens to them. They may be tier 4 vendors, if at all. Most of them are probably not even on a vendor list, because there is no contract in place with any of these vendors. So, and there are no owners. So in other words, it's kind of the shadow data that does not kind of even fall within the risk management purview, but it is large volume and it is PI, and that's where most of the enforcement has been. So it's high risk and has been called out as high risk by many of the regulations. So it just goes down to highlight like how the perspectives are, you kind of dramatically different. Similarly, when you look at classification, IG, is broadly aligned, and you're looking at broader content because you're trying to understand the entire information that is within the company. So you want to put them into buckets of confidential, internal, public, private, etc., etc. But when it comes to privacy, most of my data probably falls under confidential. Maybe some are internal, but it's one of those categories. But we're kind of focused on the granular pieces of what is PI, what is SPI, is there a PHI? Maybe PCI would be sort of along with security. PHI and PCI may be covered by security as well, but I'm focusing a lot more on the, is it biometric data? Is it geolocation data? I mean, the things that, are not even the categories of personal information that we're looking at, or is it inference data? Is it commercial data? So a lot of granularity, and none of them would align with either what security is looking at or what IG is looking at from a classification perspective, because it's too detailed. And then when it comes to the key things that you're trying to focus on, you're looking at what is a record, what is not a record. You're looking at what is business critical information that needs to be saved, what is IP. Whereas privacy professionals are looking at data flows, they're looking at usage of data, the purpose for which it was collected, they're looking at consent, withdrawal of consent, so it's moment in time, and the same data should be treated differently based on some action that a customer took, right? So it was permitted usage at certain point, but not permitted usage after a certain point. So it's a lot of detail that does not kind of most of it would is not something that is within the radar of a security or an IG professional. I want to pause just to see if there are any comments or questions, and then I'll kind of move on and we'll talk a little bit about data minimization too. Okay, so we talk about how retention and data minimization is a major focus area for IG, and obviously privacy should be working closely with IG, should be, and that's the best way for us to get to a more executable plan from a data minimization perspective. But as you look at data minimization, IG is looking at what is a record versus non-records. And so typically there is a lot of focus around legal requirements around retention, which, and mainly making sure that, any record is sort of captured and retained for the right period of time, right? So, whereas privacy is not really concerned about what is a record and what is not a record. All we are concerned about is a portion of the data that is in the database, which is the personal information. And the minute the personal information is, removed, privacy doesn't mind if the data stays forever, right? Because the privacy problems are solved. You're looking at minimum period of retention to meet the legal or regulatory requirements for each of the records and making sure that the minimum period is always maintained. Whereas privacy is looking at, hey, as soon as you stop using it, you need to get rid of it. And or as soon as a consent is withdrawn, you need to get rid of it. So it's the maximum period, so the which is a complete contrast from the way IG looks at it. And obviously we're trying to kind of look at all of the information. So we're trying to simplify and bucket it, and make sure that, you follow a big bucket for simplicity. Whereas privacy is, again, very, very granular, because you're looking at each copy of the data made, because these are promises that I'm making to a customer saying, when you give me data, I am going to use it for shipping the data to you, the goods to you. I'm going to use it for understanding your past purchase so I can personalize it for you. I'm going to use it for record keeping, and I'm going to use it for legal. So each copy of the data I make, I am making a promise for a certain reason. And so the customers have the ability to say yes to certain things and no to certain things. And so the minute they say no to certain things, I have to get rid of those copies of data. So I'm kind of dealing with minutia here, and I can't make broad sweeps, because broad sweeps don't really work when I'm trying to get consent on details from the customer and sort of react to it based on exactly what is being permitted and not permitted. So the other, in both cases, I would kind of say the data destruction, especially if you have some kind of sensitive information or confidential information, they need to be securely deleted. So there is no difference in how the deletion happens. That mostly remains the same. So, but it's the details of how I get there that matters a lot. And most of the time, the broad buckets never really works from a privacy perspective.
To pause for a second,
Yeah.
I think there's two things. One, we have a question and also a comment I'd like to make. I think this means exactly what you're about to cover. I think it really highlights the need for collaboration between the groups. And there are, in fact, a lot of people that are doing retention schedules that are starting to put in what some people might consider non-records, right? Some of these GPS tracking information, for example, or some other things that are adding to retention schedules. So they're the big bucket, like you say, doesn't exactly work when you're trying to put privacy into your program and coordinate that. Question from within the chat: are there programs that can pick up metadata and tags to be added to the material?
There are. So one of the things that are happening now is some very interesting strategies and programs being developed, right? Which would be probably the future of how retention kind of gets defined, which is being able to kind of carry the rules of deletion along with the data as it's created. So and it wouldn't apply in all cases, right? But for example, consent is passed with the data, right? So, and especially when you look at granular consent, being able to give granular consent, it goes with the data. So you're able to see that, yeah, I permitted use of data for reasons, and I did not permit the use of data for the fifth reason, let's say. Then that's something that is captured as soon as I am collecting that data. And when I do that, there are programs that are able to sort of take that consent with it. So every time it goes, to other places, whoever is receiving that data can see that, hey, this person has said yes to this, but no to this. So I can only use this for these purposes. And for the purposes where I've said the user has said no, I got to stop it. So you start to see, I mean, it's not universal, it's not but there are some very, very large scale implementations that you see in the privacy world where this is happening. And it's probably the starting of how we think about retention from a personal information perspective. Not to say that as the way we do records retention schedule is completely going to go away. But I think we probably meet in the middle, right? Like, so, you're going to see some parts of the data being deleted that way, and then other parts of deleted data that is being managed, through big buckets and broad sweeps, right? So, but they both need to meet together and work together and align together. And so and so that requires, like Chris pointed out, that collaboration and clear communication between both functions, because um, it's happening. It's not going to get executed properly, and it won't kind of both work well together and sync nicely together if that collaboration doesn't exist. Any other question that I need to answer?
Nope, that's in the chat so far. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, I think there is no way for some of this to work together, and we're talking about massive requirements, right? So privacy by design, and we'll kind of delve deep into privacy by design, but in order for privacy by design to happen, we have to have information governance in place. We need to have that kind of granular understanding of how information is managed. There's no way you can achieve that by, some of these functions like security, IG, and privacy kind of doing their own things. So it's absolutely important that that we kind of have collaboration. And it's also important for budget sharing, because there isn't going to be an unlimited budget available for compliance. We're always going to be constrained. And so it just means that we need to do more with less. And to do more with less, you need to come together and bring different parts of the organization to kind of take that money that we have for compliance, go further. The other big thing we talked about is cross-populating steering committees, even if you don't share the same steering committee, because that brings awareness, that brings deeper understanding and of each other's needs, because that goes a long way in relationship building, if I can use that word, because if security understands the nuances of, like, for example, how PI breach happens and what privacy incidents are, then they're able to kind of look for, there is a lot of infrastructure, process, technology that is already built in for security incident management. So it makes a lot of sense for privacy to leverage that. But privacy can only leverage it if the people who are kind of the eyes and are able to understand the nuance and look out for privacy interests as well. Because that's without that, we probably will miss a lot of privacy incidents, right? So it's and the same thing applies for retention. As you kind of build retention, IG needs to understand the nuances of where privacy comes from. And so without that, you can't use the same infrastructure, you can't use the same technology, you can't pull together resources. So that needs to happen. And sometimes that requires aligning of leadership roles. Maybe that things are structured where there is a central compliance function and everybody reports, so there can be meeting of minds, alignment of goals, or even otherwise you can bring collaboration through some kind of mutual understanding. Another thing that works really well sometimes is joint presentations, where when you're making presentations to the board, when you're making presentations to the leadership, there is some collaboration in what is presented and some of the initiatives. And so that brings, again, alignment of goals and common understanding. So the last part, and we'll spend quite a bit of time towards the end of the presentation talking about common frameworks. We're all looking to kind of evaluate how well we do, and frameworks helps us kind of achieve that. but we also look to communicate our goals, our expectations, and frameworks help us do that as well. So using common frameworks like NIST or common frameworks like ISO, ISO has built a framework for information governance, but being able to talk similar language and being able to use that as a point of collaboration also helps in kind of bringing the teams together and helps in working effectively together. So moving on, what is privacy by design? So privacy by design is a proactive measure that is aimed at making sure that all data processing activities at the outset are sort of built with privacy in mind. And there is no way for privacy to kind of be built by design unless there is good governance. And like we talked about, right, it means that it needs to be proactive, not reactive. You want to have it as a default measure. It's meant to be, like I said, for example, in the case of retention, it's built in to where the consent is passed, the deletion requirements are passed along at the point of collection. So that requires deep, a technology overhaul, and some of this to be built into, every product that we are talking about, and that's not possible unless when we at the time of engineering, at the time of design, pretty much everybody takes some of these requirements into consideration. And it also means that it's not just software development, but your IT projects, your ad tech projects, your procurement projects, your operation projects, every department considers privacy, at the outset before they start kind of thinking about how data flows within the organization. IG is looking to govern every piece of information that is there within the organization. So that's a common point, where the teams can work together to think about what governance means, and it's taking into consideration the requirements for privacy, taking into consideration the requirements for the business, taking into consideration the requirements for security. So bringing all of those stakeholders together can be a big thing. The biggest challenges for privacy by design, and I know we have, I'm kind of speeding up a little bit to make sure that we complete on time. So the complex, some of the challenges that we have for privacy is same for IG as well, which is, there's complex requirements, technical challenges, because nobody is building products from scratch. Sometimes you have legacy products, and some of the things that we ask for is impossible to kind of happen. Cultural issues, because people don't understand, and it seems like privacy or IG or security is pretty much considered to be a roadblocker for business. There is no economic incentive because there is no budget for some of these projects. So but some of the challenges can be overcome if you have meeting of minds, like I just brought up an example of IT, privacy, security coming together, where if you have requirements that are needed by many departments, you can pull together resources. Sometimes you can push some of this to a higher priority, and that kind of maybe is the big thing that can make things happen. As you know, NIST has a standard for privacy. NIST also has a standard for security. I really like what they kind of did, which is they built a collaboration index template to show how the two programs can come together and show how the collaboration can be helpful for both each of those programs to kind of achieve that their respective compliance, right? So from the ground up, it was built to show that you have privacy risks, you have cybersecurity risks. There are sometimes risks that are not same for both of these programs, but then there is also common interest. And when a framework is built with that kind of foundation in mind, and when you start to use that, it is very easy because you have an external reference that is used to kind of show the places where you can come together, the places which are different, and use that as a way to kind of bridge that gap and build that communication channel between both privacy and security. IG, obviously some of the biggest benefits to using frameworks is that it kind of helps in managing your risk in a more systematic manner. It shows that your where you are. You can see blind spots because it kind of tries to track all the requirements around some of these, each of these functions. And it is also easy to communicate because when you use a framework, and as IG professionals, we've always used frameworks to kind of define maturity. And so this kind of, and the same with privacy and security as well, but it kind of helps for other people to understand where you are and where you need to be, and to be able to communicate that to leadership. ISO has, built something similar for security and privacy. I'd like to see them sort of enhance their IG, principles that they established, and map it across to kind of show how IG can help enhance both security and privacy. They have, they talk about their principle 5.8 talk about how to support both privacy and security. But I think they need to enhance their framework a lot more for IG to bring it in line with where we want to see it, similar to that of security and privacy. But it's definitely a start that they have at least a framework for one, which NIST doesn't have at this point. But I think we can, as IG professionals, kind of take that framework and maybe show the common aspects between security and privacy, and show how we can collaborate, which maybe, if we start doing that, can be adopted by ISO at some point. So with that, I know we're on time, so I want to kind of conclude that there are a lot of common goals between most of these functions that we just talked about, and that should act as our North Star for collaboration. But it's important to keep our communications transparent and consistent. It's very important to understand the places where our objectives meet, and the places where our objectives may be different. It's important to sort of share resources, information as much as possible to enhance that collaboration, and also look for frameworks like NIST and ISO to use that as a basis for bringing that commonality and collaboration and establishing it. Any questions?
Feel free to type into the chat or come off mute.
I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the Q&A.
Great. I know we're at time. Thank you, Priya. You can scroll up and see what people have been commenting. I haven't seen any other questions come in. Just to completely wrap up this presentation, thank you, Priya, for this presentation on privacy. I think collaboration is the biggest thing with, just understand each other, collaborate. I also want to thank again Paul Stark at Preservica. Preservica is our sponsor. They've got an upcoming presentation on December 4th. And if you're not a member of ARMA, especially of ARMA New England, please consider joining us. We will send you a link to the recording and the slides from both Priya and from Paul. And if there's, we'll hang on for a minute. If anybody's got any questions for Priya, you can come off mute.
Will we see you at the next ARMA conference? I hope.
Shaking
Yeah.
yes, so yeah. We're roping Priya into the. Awesome. If we'll call it. Nobody else has questions. Thanks very much for joining. We'll see you at the next one. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Priya.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.